Ukraine didn't start by blowing up the Crimea Bridge, which you will see later on in this video. It started by going after something far more expensive, a reported strike on a $5 billion Russian tank factory, the industrial heart of Moscow's armored warfare, hit at the exact moment it mattered most. Not when it was idle, not when it was quiet, but when the power was on, the machines were running, and tank production was in full motion. As you'll see, once Ukraine proved it could reach deep into Russia's industrial core, another target suddenly became inevitable. A structure worth hundreds of millions in Crimea, the heartland of Ukraine. You will see the Crimean Bridge burning in fire. We start with the tank factory part, and after that comes the explosions, chaos on the Crimean Bridge. Stay tuned! At 3:17 a.m. on December 3rd, 2025, the lights inside Uralvagonzavod burned at full intensity as night shift crews in Nizhny Tagil wrestled steel into shape for new T-90 turrets, unaware that Ukrainian planners had spent months waiting for this exact moment. Russia had poured roughly $5 billion into pushing the plant into round-the-clock production, upgrading substations, hydraulic lines, and casting halls so every press stroke and welding arc drew as much power as the grid could deliver. That peak electrical load was not a coincidence to Kiev. It was the condition for maximum damage, somewhere over the snowbound fields near the Sumy border, far beyond the factory workers' horizon. The opening move of the operation had actually begun 14 hours earlier, when the first of 48 modified long-range drones clawed their way into a blizzard that would hide them from human eyes, but not from mathematics. Those airframes were not standard off-the-shelf models. Ukrainian engineers had stripped them down to bare composites, extended their wing, and bolted on external conformal fuel tanks that turned modest attack drones into cross-border strike assets. With that extra fuel, each machine could cover roughly 1,250 miles, more than enough to loop around Russian radar belts, instead of trying to punch straight through. Flying at barely 40 feet above the frozen ground, their small propellers pulled them through the whiteout at speeds slowly adjusted to match the terrain. Instead of pilots sweating over yokes, guidance computers fused input from CRPA anti-jam antennas and laser altimeters that scanned ahead hundreds of times per second. The antennas listened for satellite signals and threw away anything that looked like electronic interference, while the altimeters painted invisible lines down the slopes and up the ridges, letting the drones hug the contour. The route planners had treated Western Russia not as a flat map, but as a three-dimensional maze of overlapping detection cones. S-300 and S-400 batteries guarded the industrial heartland with overlapping fan shapes of search radar, while shorter-range systems and mobile Panzer S-1 units filled in the gaps. On a two-dimensional chart, that wall looked solid. But the Ukrainians had spent months combing satellite imagery, signals intercepts, and open-source maps to find the seams between coverage lobes. The solution was counterintuitive. Rather than skimming along the edge of the belt, the swarm would dive under it, using mountain valleys and forested lowlands in the Ural region as a kind of radio shadow. The blizzard helped, scattering radar energy with billions of ice crystals, but it was a bonus, not a crutch. The machines were built to survive even on a clear night. The storm simply made their odds better. By 3:10 a.m., the first phase of the plan reached its critical moment above the southern approaches to Nizhny Tagil. 18 Beaver-type decoy drones, stripped of heavy payloads and fitted with Lundberg reflectors, climbed away from the main formation and executed a starburst maneuver over the designated engagement zone. To the naked eye, they were just dim shapes vanishing into cloud. But to the 92 N6E fire control radar of the nearby S-400 battery, each reflector ballooned their radar cross-section into something that looked very much like a Storm Shadow-class cruise missile. 18 separate hostile tracks bloomed on the Russian operator's scope, all closing on what the algorithms considered a strategic industrial asset. The system's logic tree was simple and ruthless. Rank threats by range and apparent size, assign interceptors, and fire without hesitation. Two 48 N6DM interceptors left their canisters first, followed by more, as the software calculated new trajectories. Each missile was a 4,000-pound weapon, built to swat hypersonic targets at high altitude, now being burned on fiberglass bodies, moving at propeller speed inside a snowstorm. Solid fuel motors drove them to Mach 4 in seconds, as their active radar seekers locked onto the bright reflections from the decoys. Below, Panzer S-1 crews at a site the Ukrainians had labeled Position Alpha watched their local scopes fill with symbols, and heard their fire control computers call out target tracks faster than human voices could repeat them, unable to trust their jammed displays. Some operators switched to 30mm autocannons, hosing the blizzard with high explosive shells that traced glowing lines through the storm in frantic arcs. From a purely tactical perspective, the Russians seemed to be winning. By 3:13 a.m., burning fragments of decoy drones were scattered across the snow around the southern perimeter of the plant, and the S-400 site had logged 18 kills. Yet those victories carried an invisible cost. The battery had expended 12 long-range missiles, depleting 3 of its 4 launch tubes, while both Panzer units guarding that sector were completely dry on ready 30mm ammunition and halfway through their short-range missile stocks. Their crews were still wrestling heavy rounds into freezing magazines and reprogramming guidance settings when their scopes finally showed a clear sky. Believing the threat had been neutralized, the sector commander began to compose a report of successful defense, unaware that he had just traded his best ammunition for empty air and opened a gap that Ukrainian planners had designed into the timeline from the start. 3:14 a.m. marked the beginning of the second phase. 12 more Beaver-derived drones, outwardly similar to the decoys but modified for a very different role, slid into a holding pattern at roughly 1,500 feet above the complex. Each carried a 15-pound disposable jamming pod slung under its belly in place of a warhead, powered not by long-life batteries, but by capacitors tuned to dump their entire energy load in roughly 6 minutes. When the Ukrainian controller sent the activation code, the ring lit up in the electromagnetic spectrum. The pods blasted out carefully shaped noise across the L-band and X-band frequencies used by Russian surveillance and engagement radars. To the operators on the ground, the effect was like having a floodlight aimed directly into night vision goggle. The previously clean screens turned into blizzards of static, in which every pixel seemed to flicker with phantom echoes. Standard Russian doctrine called for switching to optical or infrared tracking when radar data became unreliable, and that is exactly what the factory's defenders tried to do. Panzer crews slewed their electro-optical turrets toward the humming they could hear above the storm, and switched through visible and thermal modes in search of silhouettes against the clouds. On any other night, this fallback would have given them at least a fighting chance. But the same blizzard that had helped conceal the inbound swarm now conspired to blind the cameras. Dense snow simply blocked visible light, turning the video feeds into gray curtains of swirling particles, while 20-mile-per-hour winds stripped heat from the slender composite airframe so efficiently that their infrared signature blended into the background sky. In the command van of the S-400 battery, officers tried to reboot radar subsystems and narrow beam widths to cut through the noise, but failed. The final twist of the jamming plan emerged only when Russian crews obeyed an order that technically violated their own safety rules. Faced with the knowledge that their radars were blind and their cameras nearly useless, the sector commander gave a desperate instruction over the net: ignore standard engagement envelopes and fire missiles at the jamming sources overhead as soon as any kind of lock could be achieved. Panzer units obeyed, rippling off 57 E-6 missiles in optical mode at close range, while a neighboring Tunguska battery added quad 30mm cannon fire that stitched orange lines into the low clouds. The jamming drones were not programmed to dodge. Their purpose was to die at the right moment. One after another took direct hits and disintegrated. Yet instead of clearing the air, their destruction triggered the next layer of the trap, because inside each supposedly simple pod lay tightly packed bundles of metallic chaff strips and a small magnesium. At the moment of destruction, each charge blossomed into a cloud of glittering metal fragments that scattered across the sky and burned brightly for several seconds before cooling into reflective debris. Millions of tiny strips drifted downward through the storm, overwhelming the returning radar pulses of every system trying to recover from the jamming. Instead of a handful of drones, Russian computers now saw what appeared to be entire swarms of high-speed objects falling simultaneously across the engagement zone. 2 Panzer systems suffered immediate software crashes as their processors attempted to track thousands of false returns, forcing their turrets to droop into emergency reset. Even the larger S-400 array froze mid-sweep, leaving only manual optical modes available. For the next 60 seconds, what had been advertised for years as an impenetrable aerial shield was reduced to blind metal amid the snowfall. At 3:17 a.m., as the last shards of metallic chaff drifted toward the roofs of maintenance sheds and assembly bays. The third wave arrived. 18 Lutyi-class strike drones, their 14-foot frames built for load-bearing rather than stealth, surged into the undefended perimeter at barely 50 feet above the tree line. Each machine housed a Honeywell-grade laser ring gyroscope that tracked positional drift with deviations measured in mere feet per hour, ensuring reliable guidance even with every form of satellite navigation turned to noise by their own electronic warfare pods. Slung beneath each drone was an 820-kilogram warhead, engineered to open armored structures rather than vehicles. A shaped charge design that turned explosive energy into a focused jet able to pierce steel, concrete, and the layered plates of large industrial presses. The first of the three groups, labeled by Ukrainian planners as the Alpha element, veered hard left toward the 500-kilovolt substation, positioned along the plant's southern edge. That substation funneled enormous electrical loads into the forge halls, powering the 25,000-ton hydraulic presses that had only recently resumed work under upgraded wiring rated for sustained maximum output. As the leading Alpha drone pointed its nose downward, the shape of the transformer complex glowed prominent in the drone's targeting algorithms, which recognized heat gradients and structural outlines even through snow. When the shaped charge warhead struck the ceramic casing of the main transformer, the resulting arc flared blue-white, hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporizing cooling oil and sending an electrical surge cascading across the internal conductors. Inside the cavernous press hall, workers felt the floor tremble a heartbeat before the lights died. 50,000 gallons of high-pressure hydraulic fluid rested inside the lines, feeding two giant presses. And when Team Bravo of the strike drones breached the roof from 500 feet above, those lines became the weakest link. The first Bravo drone knifed through a skylight and buried its warhead into the central cylinder of press number 1. The copper liner inverted upon detonation, producing a jet moving at tens of thousands of feet per second that sliced through steel like fabric. The explosion forced steel doors from their hinges and hurled debris across the production floor. Seconds later, the second and third drones followed, their charges targeting the companion press. Heat built so rapidly inside the hall that structural columns deformed. While those detonations shook the interior of the complex, Team Charlie completed the outer phase of the strike. 10 drones streaked between storage sheds and open yards, where T-90 hulls waited in rows for paint and final assembly. Despite the heavy armor, the drones ignored the thickest plating, instead locking onto engine compartments, access hatches, and fuel inlets. One drone's detonation cascaded across 3 adjacent hulls, when stored lubricants flashed into flame. Within moments, the yard looked like a line of failed suns casting long shadows over the snow as fresh flakes melted mid-air before reaching the ground. The operators in their remote bunkers monitored telemetry until each drone confirmed impact, then shifted to thermal feeds to assess damage patterns spreading across the site. When the final warhead detonated, the blast reverberated across the silent factory grounds. The S-400 battery's radar systems completed their reboot only after the decisive strikes had already occurred, leaving crews staring helplessly at the flare of heat blooms smeared across their displays. By then, the hydraulic presses were irrecoverable, their housings warped, cylinders collapsed, and internal precision surfaces cooled into misaligned forms that could not be machined back to tolerance. Those presses were 2 of only 4 such machines within the Russian Federation, each required for forging single-piece turret rings capable of withstanding impacts better than welded alternatives. Without them, production would revert to 1955 methods, forcing turret assemblies to be cast in smaller sections and welded together. That process tripled production time and reduced armor integrity by roughly 40%, a regression that rippled outward to every contractor. Analysts in Kiev estimated that the attack brought at least half a year of reduced pressure on Ukrainian frontline units, granting breathing room measured not just in time but in avoided casualties. By 6 a.m., as snow continued falling over the skeletal remains of the press hall, videos recorded by stunned workers began circulating across encrypted channels and then emerging on open networks. Grainy clips showed the factory in total darkness, punctuated only by fires still smoldering among the debris. The myth of the Ural fortress, long held as a symbol of industrial resilience, seemed to unravel in real time. Citizens questioned how a facility considered one of Russia's safest assets had fallen in less than 2 minutes. Defense officials attempted to explain away the failure by citing unprecedented weather and unusual tactics, but the images told a different story. An undefended industrial giant struck with surgical precision despite layers of expensive protection. Somewhere in Moscow, planners faced the sobering arithmetic of $2 million spent against billions in losses, and the realization that the battlefield had expanded deep into territory once thought unreachable. At the same moment, officials drafted internal briefings. Ukrainian analysts pored over telemetry captured throughout the operation. The recordings showed how each phase had aligned with precise timing, from the low-altitude penetration of the first wave to the artificially induced radar blindness that opened the door for the Luty-class drones. Those 820-kilogram warheads, originally tested for penetrating hardened depot, had performed beyond expectations when striking equipment under full operational load. Structural stresses, elevated temperatures, and active hydraulic cycles had all magnified the destructive potential. Engineers reviewing the footage noted that the press hall's failure initiated not only from the shaped charge penetrations, but from thermal gradients tearing metal apart faster than any tool could follow. The attack was more than a strike. It was a controlled industrial collapse executed under cover of snow. Inside Ukrainian command centers, operators watched the aftermath unfold with analytical calm. Each drone's final telemetry suggested how environmental conditions had influenced its guidance, revealing subtle drift patterns that would be corrected in future missions. Engineers noted how the blizzard had masked visible signatures while simultaneously reducing infrared contrast, forcing reliance on inertial platforms and laser ring gyroscopes that never once deviated beyond their narrow error margins. The data confirmed what planners had theorized for months, that coordinated electronic obscuration combined with weather alignment could nullify even layered Russian air defense systems. The decoy wave had not merely absorbed missiles. It had manipulated engagement priorities, convincing automated logic trees to exhaust the very resources needed to stop the main attack. Every second from 3:10 a.m. to 3:17 a.m. had been structured to exploit those tendencies. Russian response teams deployed to the darkened factory with difficulty. Roads leading toward the complex were partially blocked by snowdrifts, and emergency lighting remained offline after the substation failure. Fire crews attempting to approach the wrecked press hall found molten metal cooling in uneven sheets that still radiated heat hours after the detonations. Inside the scorched chamber, columns bowed like softened rails, and fragments of the hydraulic cylinder lay fused into warped plates that had once been precision-machined surfaces. The air held the sharp scent of burned lubricant and vaporized steel, marking the boundary between what had stood and what had collapsed. Technicians arriving at dawn realized quickly that no salvage protocol would restore the presses to function. Even disassembly for transport was impossible. The machines had effectively melted into immovable masses bound to the factory floor. As official assessments trickled upward, Russian industrial planners confronted grim mathematics. Replacing a 25,000-ton hydraulic press was not simply a matter of funding, but of global capability. Only a handful of facilities worldwide could produce equipment of similar scale, and none would risk violating sanctions to ship a replacement. Even if clandestine channels were attempted, fabrication and transport would require years, not months, leaving the tank program without its core machinery. Welding turret rings from segmented components introduced structural weaknesses that ballistics experts had spent decades trying to eliminate. Tanks assembled with such compromises would not survive impacts that their predecessors endured, reducing battlefield survivability at a time when losses were already unsustainable. Supply officers understood the cascade immediately. Delays in the turret production meant idle assembly lines, bottlenecked drivetrain suppliers, and overstocked inventory with no final platform to receive it. Further complications emerged across the broader logistical network. Rail shipments carrying engines toward Nizhny Tagil were halted and redirected, causing congestion at hubs that had not been designed for extended storage. Workers at satellite facilities found themselves processing components for tanks that no longer had completion timelines, creating mismatches between labor, output, and strategic demand. Fuel allocations, once earmarked for transporting finished armor, were reassigned to other sectors, straining distribution patterns already disrupted by earlier strikes. The attack's impact propagated like a shockwave through spreadsheets and procurement systems, leaving officers scrambling to reassign budgets while acknowledging that no short-term solution existed. The shutdown of Uralvagonzavod was not merely a local failure. It represented a structural fracture in a defense ecosystem dependent on synchronized flow.
According to preliminary data, this morning a truck exploded on the road section of the Crimea Bridge from the side of the Taman Peninsula.
Russia's investigative committee says the blast was caused by a truck bomb and has identified the truck's owner as a resident of the city of Krasnodar.
At 4:14 local time on June 24th, 2025, a Russian Pantsir S-1 convoy rolled toward the Azovka Bridge, believing it was entering safe rear territory, not a prepared killing ground. The column carried firepower that normally travels under layered protection, not stretched across a single steel span above a narrow valley. For the crews inside the vehicles, this was a routine pre-dawn redeployment, another movement order on a crowded war map. For Ukrainian planners, however, those coordinates had been highlighted for weeks. They knew that within the hour, a decision taken in Moscow would align metal, explosives, and weak concrete in a way that could not be undone. The story did not begin on the bridge. It began in quiet back rooms where Ukrainian negotiators pushed a civilian-focused proposal that sounded almost boring on paper, a controlled humanitarian corridor across a 1.6-mile inland route that snaked through the hills toward Kherson. Officially, it was about food, medicine, and evacuees. Unofficially, it was a test of Russian intent and a way to measure how much Moscow valued this crossing. When the Kremlin rejected the accord, not gradually, but with an explicit personal refusal from the top, Ukrainian intelligence analysts understood the signal. If Russia would not use Azovka as a pressure valve, it would probably use it as a spearhead. Azovka Bridge itself was never meant to carry the weight of strategy. Built as a quiet inland artery, it stretched over a narrow valley with welded spans and concrete piers that engineers once considered adequate for mixed civilian traffic. Over time, maintenance delays and heavier military loads left scars that only specialists noticed. Span 145, a central segment of the deepest part of the ravine, had developed micro-fractures around an aging support bearing. For Ukraine, that span became an opportunity. Structural reports, satellite imagery, and seismic readings fed simulations that asked a simple question: how much force would it take to turn this crossing from asset into liability? The answer arrived from Moscow in the form of an order signed hours before sunrise. Instead of allowing neutral relief convoys, Russia pushed a 22-vehicle Pantsir S-1 column into the very corridor Ukraine had already marked as fragile. 6 launchers, 4 radar-controlled vehicles, 2 mobile command trucks, and 10 ammunition carriers loaded with roughly 14,057 E-6 missiles were told to move south and prepare the skies for a new thrust toward Kherson. On paper, this looked like a mobile air defense spearhead, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment. In practice, it formed a single line of explosives and electronics, heading straight for the weakest span. Ukrainian planners had already reserved their answer. In a forward operations room, officers from the Air Force and military intelligence studied a digital model of the valley, tracing approach paths that threaded between Russian radar lobes like a needle through cloth. The platform of choice was the F-16 Block 50, a multi-role fighter able to carry precision glide munitions while staying low over terrain. Each jet would lift with a pair of bombs weighing roughly 250 kilograms apiece, weapons that could glide many kilometers before diving onto coordinates with meter-level accuracy. The objective was not only to destroy vehicles, but to drive force directly into the stress lines of span 145. By 4:10 a.m., the first decision that mattered was already fixed. Humanitarian traffic would not cross Azovka. Combat vehicles would. 24 minutes later, at roughly 4:32, the Pantsir column rolled onto the approach road, engines droning at convoy speed while drivers scanned for roadside threats, not for danger from the sky. The crews believed they sat deep enough inside friendly lines to be untouchable. Their radars remained in transit mode, antennas folded or set to passive, conserving power and revealing little. To them, this was a safe inland bridge with no coastline, no obvious enemy firing positions, just layered hills and a steel ribbon arcing across a sleeping valley. That same valley looked very different through Ukrainian eyes. Long before the first vehicle touched the span, surveillance assets had mapped every contour, every heat source, every echo that mattered. When the 22-vehicle line began to stretch across the bridge deck, analysts in Kyiv watched icons slide into a single choke point and marked the moment as irreversible exposure. Around 4:47, clearance moved through encrypted channels to the forward fighter detachment. Minutes later, 2 F-16s left their shelter, climbed just high enough to clear terrain, then dropped back into the folds of the landscape, throttles at military power, radar sets quiet, closing on Azovka under the cover of the hills. At 4:55 a.m., the lead fighter eased upward just enough for its sensors to gain visual confirmation on the target area. Below, the entire Russian formation stretched bumper to bumper across the bridge, each vehicle positioned with mathematical precision for a strike they could not see coming. The pilot watched the geometry stabilize, letting the aircraft's targeting computer convert bridge coordinates, vehicle spacing, and glide angle into a firing solution. When the authorization indicator turned green, the 2 GBU-39 bombs detached from their pylons, their wings deploying instantly as they dove toward the steel span, with guidance algorithms measuring distance in inches rather than meters. Above the valley, the fighters banked away, engines staying below afterburner to avoid generating signatures that surviving sensors might detect. The first bomb struck the nearest radar control vehicle, its warhead punching through metal plating before igniting the equipment inside. The explosion sprayed fragments outward, shredding antenna arrays and throwing shards over the guardrail. Helmets and panels briefly appeared as heat spots on infrared before vanishing into the rising blast cloud. The second bomb descended toward an ammunition carrier, a truck loaded with thousands of missiles whose propellant mass turned the entire rear of the convoy into a volatile chain waiting for a spark. When the warhead triggered, the delayed reaction lasted only a heartbeat. Then the cargo ignited, sending a white-hot plume along the deck that tore through the formation like a shockwave. Within seconds, canisters ruptured in rapid succession. Fuel tanks ignited as temperatures surged past thresholds that military vehicles were never designed to withstand. Infrared sensors recorded the blast column rising more than 200 feet, bright enough to overload some of the receiving equipment. The shockwave rolled into the hillsides, cracking glass in a village nearly 2 kilometers away. On the bridge, the 22-vehicle formation turned into a burning chain of debris as flames spilled across the asphalt surface. Vehicle frames bent and collapsed as heat exceeded temperatures known to warp structural steel. Around 4:57, the bridge itself began to react. No longer a stable platform, but a structure-absorbing force it could not redistribute. Minutes later, the consequences began reaching Russian command posts. Around 5:02 a.m., fragmented reports indicated a catastrophic loss, with thermal readings near the bridge still above 600 degrees Celsius. Drones dispatched for assessment disappeared from feeds as residual explosions from cooking-off missiles destroyed their optics. Attempts to move ground teams closer were delayed by intense heat and continuing detonations every dozen or so seconds. Operators initially suspected sabotage or guided artillery. Only later did satellite data clarify the pattern. 2 precise impact craters marking the signatures of F-16 delivered glide munitions. When analysts calculated the equipment lost, they faced a total write-off of mobile air defense assets valued at well over $230 million. The loss reshaped regional defense planning instantly. With roughly 11% of their mobile interceptors gone in one event, Russian commanders halted preparations for the planned push toward Kherson. Aircraft operating within a 150-kilometer radius were grounded under emergency protocols. Air defense coverage collapsed into temporary blind spots, forcing units to reposition and accept delays. At the same time, Ukrainian pilots completed the second half of their mission, withdrawing along low-altitude corridors, while Russian radar networks attempted to recover from the destruction of multiple mobile units. 3 of the 6 radar trucks had been incinerated outright. 2 were split by the blast. 1 had been thrown several hundred meters downrange and left unrecognizable. Ukrainian signals teams capitalized on the confusion, inserting decoy transmissions and false radar echoes into channels that Russian operators were trying to recover. For several minutes, Russian screens displayed conflicting data streams filled with ghost signatures that drew attention away from the retreating fighters. By 5:06 a.m., both jets crossed back into secure airspace, the mission log showing a total duration of 29 minutes from launch to touchdown. Analysts reviewing the strike later confirmed that the bombs impacted within less than a meter of their designated aim points, a level of accuracy that reflected coordination between intelligence, pilots, and surveillance teams monitoring every variable leading up to the strike. Within hours, Ukrainian forces launched coordinated FP-5 drone attacks that targeted exposed logistics vehicles and secondary command shelters. 9 supply trucks and 2 mobile command sites were destroyed in a series of strikes made possible by the absence of air defense units that had been eliminated on the bridge. Supply routes that once moved east to west now rerouted nearly 85 kilometers to avoid gaps in coverage, adding transit delays that stretched to 14 hours in some cases. Reports from frontline battalions indicated that daily resupply fell to as low as 40% of normal levels, slowing operations and forcing planners to reconsider timetables across the region. At mid-morning, international monitoring stations confirmed what Ukrainian analysts had already concluded. The blast from Azovka Bridge registered across a radius of more than 92 kilometers, placing it among the most significant non-nuclear detonations recorded that year. Satellite sensors captured thermal spikes, airborne particulates, and shock patterns that aligned with a cascading series of munitions ignitions rather than a single detonation. Analysts reviewing the data noted that by concentrating such a large volume of explosives on a structurally vulnerable span, Russian command had unintentionally created the conditions for a catastrophic chain reaction. This concentration amplified the effect of Ukraine's precision strike far beyond the destructive potential of the bombs alone, functioning as an explosive multiplier that no defensive doctrine could offset once ignition occurred. Across Russian channels, the internal reaction followed a predictable rhythm. Early transmissions included speculation about sabotage or the use of an unfamiliar long-range weapon. However, as overhead imagery arrived, the patterns became unmistakable. 2 aligned impact zones on the bridge deck matched the profile of glide munitions launched from low-flying fighters. Damage to the convoy displayed a sequence consistent with a chain reaction beginning at an ammunition carrier. Thermal signatures from the aftermath showed repeated bursts linked to missile propellant cooking off under sustained heat. As these findings spread, the operational consequences grew clearer. An air defense formation designed to shield southern ground forces had been reduced to scorched fragments in seconds. And with it, an entire operational plan collapsed. Russian commanders in the region confronted immediate constraints. Units positioned near the Kherson axis lacked the air defense coverage that allowed them to move with confidence in areas vulnerable to drones and low-flying aircraft. As a result, formations were ordered to halt or slow their advance until temporary replacements could be arranged. Logistics crews found themselves restricted to daylight movements along altered supply routes, reducing throughput and increasing exposure. Communications teams attempted to re-establish coherent radar coverage but faced the loss of critical nodes, each one requiring specialized equipment and trained operators. In the hours that followed, priority lists shifted from offensive momentum to damage control, a transition that reverberated through planning cells and field commanders alike. For Ukrainian intelligence, the operation provided a wealth of data that extended beyond immediate tactical success. Analysis teams examined the bridge collapse frame by frame, comparing heat maps and deformation patterns to pre-strike models. The correlation between explosive force and structural failure confirmed assessments that Span 145 represented a critical weakness. The manner in which the deck folded and separated exposed long-standing maintenance deficiencies. Even without the chain reaction, the span might have failed under a smaller blast if precisely placed. This validation informed future planning discussions that focused on identifying similar vulnerabilities along key military routes across occupied territory, marking them for potential interdiction should opportunities arise. The effects on Russian logistics manifested rapidly. Units relying on Azovka Bridge as part of their supply chain faced delays that rippled through their schedules. Fuel deliveries arrived late, ammunition movement slowed. Rerouted convoys traveled longer distances on roads that were not designed for heavy traffic, creating bottlenecks that forced some groups to wait for hours before passing through narrow choke points. Reports from the field described shortages of spare parts for armored vehicles, reduced availability of medical supplies, and the need for improvised fuel distribution using smaller trucks that took additional trips to meet demand. Although no single shortage threatened collapse on its own, together they increased pressure on units already balancing complex operational requirements. In Moscow, briefings presented an unwelcome picture. The loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in air defense equipment, the destruction of a critical bridge, and the subsequent disruptions placed planners in a difficult position. Rebuilding Azovka would require specialized engineering brigades, protected work zones, and a sustained flow of materials that could themselves become targets. Until reconstruction progressed, forces in the sector operated with reduced flexibility. Decision-makers faced a reality in which a single strike delivered by 2 aircraft had undone months of logistical preparation and forced revisions to timetables that had previously appeared stable. The incident served as an example of how precision, timing, and intelligence could offset numerical and material advantages. Even as reconstruction planning began, Ukrainian analysts continued reviewing communications intercepts and movement data to assess the longer-term consequences of the strike. Shifts in Russian redeployment patterns suggested that commanders sought to compensate for their reduced air defense presence by dispersing assets more widely than before. This dispersion lowered the effectiveness of integrated coverage that previously allowed layered protection. In addition, the need to pull units from secondary sectors to reinforce vulnerable points introduced imbalances that Ukrainian planners watched closely. Each change in the defensive grid created openings or increased stress on adjacent sectors. These adjustments carried risks that could influence future operations across the southern theater. In the days following the incident, the psychological effects became evident in intercepted conversations and field reports. Some Russian soldiers expressed concern about traveling across inland bridges previously assumed to be secure. Drivers questioned why such a large convoy had been directed onto a single span without active radar scanning. Others worried about the possibility of additional strikes targeting similar bottlenecks. For Ukrainian forces, the operation demonstrated that careful surveillance and precise timing could produce disproportionate results, even against heavily equipped formations. It reinforced the value of integrating intelligence, engineering assessments, and air power into a unified operation aimed at specific vulnerabilities, rather than broad frontline engagements. As assessments continued, the broader implications became clear. The strike at Azovka Bridge highlighted a shift in the conflict where infrastructure once considered safe could become decisive points of failure. The vulnerability of logistics corridors, combined with the reach of precision munitions, created an environment in which concentrating high-value assets in narrow spaces carried unacceptable risk. The incident underscored how modern warfare increasingly favored forces that could analyze, anticipate, and exploit structural or operational weaknesses. For Ukraine, it served as proof that careful coordination enabled them to shape events far beyond the immediate battlefield. For Russia, it exposed how quickly a single oversight could unravel an entire operational design. The sailors on the Turkish cargo ship first thought they were watching a distant storm. A low buzzing grew louder above the port of Novorossiysk. Then the sky fractured into streaks of light as Ukrainian drones skimmed the waterline and climbed almost vertically toward the shore. Cameras shook on mobile phones, curses were muttered in Turkish, and someone laughed nervously as an explosion lit up a fuel tank on the pier. What made these images unforgettable was not only the violence unfolding a few hundred meters away, but the attitude of the crew. They leaned on railings, smoking and joking, while Russian air defense tracers tore uselessly into the wrong patch of sky, as if the war now belonged to someone else and Russia was only a background actor. Those minutes recorded from a stranded merchant vessel captured the essence of a new phase in the Black Sea War. While Ukrainian sea-launched and air-launched drones hunted targets for hours, the Russian Black Sea Fleet remained at anchor, searchlights sweeping, but guns largely silent. Sirens echoed from the shoreline, flashes marked impact points at depots and warehouses. Yet the Turkish sailors filmed with the detached calm of tourists documenting a fireworks show. For decades, Russian warships in this harbor had symbolized regional dominance. Now, those same ships looked like static scenery, pinned to the pier, while smaller, cheaper machines rewrote the balance of power above and around them in real time. This night was not an isolated spectacle. It formed one of many blows in a 3-week offensive that began on the 14th of November and continued until the 5th of December, stretching from Novorossiysk to waters approaching the Turkish coast. In that period, Ukrainian forces executed a continuous sequence of drone and missile strikes against ports, tank farms, and maritime traffic that together amounted to an undeclared blockade. The aim was not to fight a classic naval battle, ship against ship, but to strangle the logistical bloodstream that kept Russian guns firing and Russian refineries connected to global markets, while proving that distance and heavy armor no longer guaranteed safety. At the center of this strategy stood the decision to treat Russia's Black Sea ports as a single connected system, rather than separate targets. Novorossiysk supplied fuel, ammunition, and commercial cargo. Terminals on the Taman Peninsula acted as gateways to the Sea of Azov. Smaller facilities along the coast handled everything from grain to coal. Ukrainian planners mapped this network as one continuous chain and then set out to break as many links as possible in rapid succession. Each successful hit on a depot or loading pier forced ships to divert, and every diversion pushed them closer to danger, compressing traffic into narrower corridors where drones and missiles could find them more easily. The opening blows focused on demonstrating that Russian air defenses, long advertised as among the most advanced in the world, were in practice disoriented and vulnerable. On several nights, including the one recorded by the Turkish crew, Russian batteries concentrated fire in the opposite direction from incoming drones, chasing decoys, while real weapons slid in low over the sea. Radar operators seemed to expect threats from predictable vectors, while Ukrainian engineers deliberately chose unorthodox approach paths, masking drones among civilian traffic or sea clutter. The result was a pattern of explosions along fuel lines and dockside equipment that suggested not random luck, but careful exploitation of psychological and technical blind spots. Behind the spectacle lay a new Ukrainian destruction package that blended domestic innovation with Western assistance. The best-known component was the R-360 Neptune missile, originally a coastal defense weapon and now adapted for deep strike roles. New versions of this missile were reported to reach roughly 1,000 kilometers, carrying warheads weighing more than 250 kilograms, enough to break through hardened structures inside port complexes. Fired from concealed launchers on shore, these Neptunes hunted strategic assets such as S-400 air defense batteries positioned to shield naval bases, turning the supposed guardians of the coast into high-value targets in their own right. The second pillar of the campaign consisted of jet-powered long-range drones, often referred to in Ukrainian sources as Bur-type systems. Unlike earlier propeller-driven models, these craft accelerated to around 800 kilometers per hour and flew at varying altitudes, complicating interception. Their thermobaric warheads, estimated between 50 and 100 kilograms, were not designed to sink large warships outright, but to shred exposed infrastructure, ignite fuel reservoirs, and render harbor facilities temporarily unusable. Speed, low radar signature, and flexible routing forced Russian defenders to track multiple fast-moving echoes, eroding reaction time to well under a single second in many engagements. Port infrastructure itself was assigned to specialized unmanned platforms, labeled in open sources as FP-1 and FP-2 series drones. These machines carried heavier payloads, often between 100 and 120 kilograms, and were programmed to dive directly into cranes, loading arms, and pier heads. Where a missile might crater a yard, an FP-series strike could sever the mechanical arms that actually moved cargo between ship and shore, turning a functional terminal into a pile of twisted metal. By pairing these drones with real-time reconnaissance, Ukrainian operators could aim not just at large storage tanks, but at specific choke points whose loss would immobilize entire facilities for weeks. The most symbolically significant land-based strike came on the 5th of December at the port complex on the Taman Peninsula, widely described by analysts as the main gateway to the Sea of Azov. This area served not only as a fuel hub for Crimean-bound traffic, but also as a redistribution point for grain and coal previously seized from occupied cities like Mariupol and Berdyansk. By tearing through storage facilities and loading equipment there, Ukrainian forces undermined both the military logistics chain and a lucrative shadow economy that had helped finance the invasion. Flames rising from Taman meant that the cost of occupation would now include direct attacks on the profit centers that made that occupation sustainable. From the 14th of November onward, data from shipping trackers and regional observers began to reveal the cumulative impact of this pressure. Vessels that had once treated Novorossiysk as a secure anchor point hesitated offshore or diverted to more distant ports. Insurance premiums for any route skirting the northeastern Black Sea climbed sharply as underwriters recalculated the probability of drone strikes against tankers and cargo ships. Captains weighed the risk of entering a harbor where videos of burning terminals circulated daily on social networks, knowing that even a minor incident could strand their vessel for weeks, ruin reputations, and trigger expensive legal disputes over damaged cargo and environmental contamination. By the time the first week of December ended, Russia's Black Sea port network resembled less a disciplined naval bastion, and more a series of embattled islands linked by fragile commercial threads. Novorossiysk, once promoted as a safe alternative to Crimean bases threatened by long-range Ukrainian weapons, now sat squarely inside the danger zone. Every tanker docking there became a potential symbol of vulnerability rather than strength. Ukrainian strategists understood that the true value of these strikes lay not only in destroyed infrastructure, but also in the message sent to every shipowner and insurer watching the region. The message was simple and brutal. That proximity to Russia's main ports no longer guaranteed protection. It invited risk. For weeks prior, maritime intelligence groups had observed irregular drone signatures slipping across commercial traffic lanes that mirrored shipping routes. The strikes on the Chiros and the Virat confirmed what many analysts suspected, that Ukraine had extended its surveillance and engagement reach far beyond the immediate zones surrounding Russian ports. The fact that both tankers were empty underscored the primary purpose of the attacks, not to trigger catastrophic oil spills, but to compromise Russia's economic throughput by destroying the vessels it relied on to move energy products. Damaged hulls, evacuated crews, and days lost to inspections created economic losses disproportionate to the actual physical damage inflicted. Russian commentators pointed to the location of these incidents as evidence of a widening confrontation. Kandera sits along one of the busiest maritime arteries connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, with thousands of vessels passing annually under the monitoring of the Turkish Coast Guard. The strikes occurred despite this oversight, suggesting that surveillance assets had difficulty distinguishing combat drones from the clutter of civilian movement. Meanwhile, Turkish authorities maintained measured silence, a posture that echoed their response to the earlier Russian strike on a Turkish civilian ship in Izmail on the 17th of November, 2025. This symmetry of silence signaled a subtle shift in regional sentiment, where Ankara appeared unwilling to shield Moscow from the consequences of its own escalation. The pattern continued on the 2nd of December 2025 when another tanker, the Mid-Volga II, flying a Russian flag, was hit approximately 80 miles off Turkey's northern coastline while transporting sunflower oil to Georgia. This was the third tanker struck within a span of 1 week, reinforcing the perception that the Black Sea had transformed from a stable trade route into a contested arena where even routine commercial voyages carried heightened danger. The cumulative psychological impact on the maritime community became evident as seasoned captains refused assignments to Russian-bound ports, citing unacceptable exposure for their crews. As commercial uncertainty grew, logistical systems that relied on predictable vessel rotation began to strain. The Turkish shipping operator Besiktas Denizcilik, one of the most experienced carriers in the region, announced a suspension of its operations involving Russian oil transport, describing risk levels as unsustainable. When such a major player withdrew, the message to the industry was unmistakable that the Black Sea's commercial environment had effectively shut its doors to Russian energy exports. With fewer ships willing to load cargo, Russia's seaborne oil shipments fell sharply in November 2025 to roughly 1.7 million barrels per day, marking a decline of approximately 31% from October. This contraction rippled through Russia's broader economic architecture. With maritime routes constrained, domestic storage filled rapidly, forcing refineries to reduce output. Inland transportation networks struggled to compensate, as road and rail options lacked the capacity to absorb volumes formerly pushed through Novorossiysk and Taman. Russian analysts warned privately that a prolonged eruption could reduce annual oil revenues by tens of billions of dollars, with the figure of $25 billion often cited as a threshold for significant budgetary strain. Each delayed shipment, each vessel idling offshore, and each cancelled contract translated into shrinking revenue streams that Moscow had counted on to sustain its military operations. On the battlefield, the loss of stable port access had immediate consequences. Novorossiysk had served as a pivotal alternative supply chain to the Crimean Bridge, whose vulnerability had been exposed by repeated Ukrainian strikes. Military convoys depended on fuel and munitions arriving through the port, moving onward to the fronts in Zaporizhia and Donetsk. When port activity stalled, deliveries slowed and armored units faced shortages that limited operational tempo. Videos circulated online of Russian tank brigades rationing fuel, a stark contrast to earlier claims of abundant reserves. The strategic cost of losing Novorossiysk as a reliable supply node extended far beyond maritime inconvenience. It imposed a creeping paralysis on frontline operations. Ukraine's success in undermining Russia's naval logistics did not stem from possessing a large navy. On the contrary, Ukraine entered the conflict without cruisers or submarines, relying instead on an array of asymmetric tools. The true advantage lay in integrating intelligence, sabotage, long-range drones, and precision missiles across a single operational picture. This approach targeted the vulnerabilities of a conventional navy that relied on predictable deployments and cumbersome protection systems. With carefully timed strikes, Ukraine compelled the Russian Black Sea Fleet to pull back from exposed positions, hiding vessels not only in Sevastopol, but also deeper inside Crimean and mainland harbors. As Ukrainian pressure intensified throughout November and December, long-trusted Crimean naval bases became untenable. Facilities in Sevastopol and Feodosia were repeatedly hit, leaving dry docks, fuel depots, and repair shops damaged or unusable. The elite Ukrainian intelligence formation known as the Ghosts Unit dedicated weeks to weakening Russia's defensive umbrella by eliminating Podlet K1 radar installations that fed data to S-400 batteries. Breaking these radar links blinded systems that were supposed to detect and intercept incoming threats, opening corridors for subsequent strikes. Reports from early December indicated that a MiG-29 fighter jet and its associated radar node were destroyed on the 4th of December, further eroding Russia's ability to defend critical infrastructure. The collapse of Crimean defenses forced Russian commanders to implement a contingency plan, relocating a significant portion of the fleet to Novorossiysk. This move was intended to place ships out of reach of Ukrainian drones, yet the strikes documented by Turkish sailors proved that assumption obsolete. Vessels anchored at Novorossiysk found themselves within range of evolving Ukrainian capabilities, leaving no safe harbor. As losses mounted, Russian strategists floated the idea of shifting assets even farther east to Abkhazia, using the port of Oshimchira as a defensive refuge. But this so-called plan faced the same structural problem. Ukraine's long-range unmanned systems could reach targets far beyond traditional expectations, rendering geographic relocation ineffective. This erosion of defensive options created a psychological dilemma inside Russia, For centuries, Russian rulers had pursued access to warm water seas as a cornerstone of strategic identity, viewing maritime presence as proof of great power status. Crimea's annexation in 2014 was framed domestically as the fulfillment of this historic ambition. Yet the events of late 2025 showed the opposite reality, that Russia's naval assets were now confined, its freedom of movement curtailed, and its ability to deter adversaries weakened. Instead of projecting power across the Black Sea, the fleet found itself sheltering in increasingly vulnerable harbors, unable to influence the war as intended. Russian civilians in regions near affected ports experienced the psychological dimension firsthand. Residents of Novorossiysk, accustomed to thinking of warfare as distant, awoke to the sound of detonations, saw smoke rising from facilities they once considered secure, and heard contradictory statements from officials. The gap between official reassurances and visible destruction widened, undermining public confidence in the state's ability to protect critical areas. This erosion of trust extended beyond port cities, echoing through regions reliant on energy revenues and transport networks, now entangled in a conflict that felt both closer and more unpredictable. By early December, the strategic landscape of the Black Sea had shifted in ways that few observers anticipated at the start of the year. Ukraine had not only disrupted maritime routes, but also challenged long-held assumptions about naval power. By turning the Black Sea into an environment where large ships became liabilities rather than assets, Ukraine forced Russia to confront the limits of its conventional strength. What emerged was a contest defined not by traditional fleets or large-scale naval battles, but by intelligence-driven precision operations that eroded Russia's maritime relevance step by step. As winter deepened, the cumulative disruption across the maritime corridor began to reshape global trade flows. Freight companies searching for alternatives attempted to reroute shipments through the eastern Mediterranean, the Caucasus, or the Danube. But each substitute route introduced delays and additional cost layers. Cargo that once crossed the Black Sea in predictable cycles now faced uncertainty at every stage, from port entry approvals to insurance verification. For Russia, the more immediate problem was that every diverted shipment reduced revenue in a fiscal year already strained by sanctions and wartime expenditures. Budget planners in Moscow quietly acknowledged mounting pressure as reserves, earmarked for strategic programs, were redirected to stabilize fuel distribution and replace damaged infrastructure. Within intelligence circles, the conversation shifted toward understanding how a country without a traditional navy had overturned assumptions held for decades. Ukraine's operational model relied on agile teams analyzing satellite feeds, open-source intelligence, intercepted communications, and real-time data streams from reconnaissance units. These analysts constructed dynamic threat maps that guided drone operators and missile crews to strike during windows of maximal effect. A harbor that appeared calm at dusk could be flooded with unmanned systems by nightfall, leaving defenders scrambling to identify targets amid a swarm of overlapping signals. This level of coordination suggested long-term planning rather than improvisation, a recognition that conventional fleets struggle when the nature of confrontation evolves faster than their structures permit. Russian military planners debated how to counter these asymmetric tools, but the structural challenges ran deep. Large surface vessels required extensive refueling, maintenance, and berthing capacity, all of which were vulnerable to aerial and maritime drones. Relocating ships farther east bought time but did not reduce exposure, as Ukraine's long-range systems extended their reach steadily. Installing more air defenses proved difficult because batteries were already stretched across multiple fronts, forced to choose between protecting cities, military bases, and industrial facilities. Each attack that bypassed these defenses illustrated the widening gap between Russia's theoretical capabilities and the practical realities of its overstressed logistics network.